Okay, so this is an economics podcast. We like graphs and numbers and forecasts. But sometimes politics bursts in and changes everything. That's what's happening in Germany.
Unser Kontinent muss jetzt auch für unsere Verteidigung gelten, whatever it takes.
Chancellor-in-waiting Friedrich Merz has done the financial equivalent of a handbrake U-turn. He's targeting changes that rip up Germany's fiscal rulebook and mean a dramatic increase in military and infrastructure spending. It's one of the biggest political shifts since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and could be a game changer for Europe's biggest economy and the bloc at large. So we thought we'd dig into it. It's what we do here on Reuters Econ World. Every week, we pick a phrase or buzzword and go deep on the economic principles and ideas driving the biggest news around the world. So this week, Germany's fiscal bazooka. I'm your host, Carmel Crimmins in Dublin. There's that saying that a week is a long time in politics. Right now, one day can turn the world upside down.
You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's bitter Oval Office clash with US President Donald Trump was one of those days, highlighting for European leaders just how fraught the transatlantic alliance is and the need for them to strengthen their own defences. Friedrich Merz, who's expected to succeed Olaf Scholz as Chancellor of Germany, quickly announced a plan to unleash hundreds of billions of euros in defence and infrastructure spending. It's not yet a done deal, but the move has set financial markets alight and analysts scrambling to update their growth forecasts. So here to talk about this economic and political thunderbolt, we have Mark John, our European economics editor based in London, and Thomas Eskrit, our senior correspondent in Berlin. Thomas, Mark, thanks so much for joining me.
Hello.
A pleasure.
Thomas, this really is a historic moment for Germany.
It really is quite a moment in the sense that Germany has always been the kind of brake in the European Union on debt spending. It's always been the stern voice admonishing other countries, Ireland in the past, Portugal, Greece.
Yeah, I was about to say, we know all about that here in Dublin.
Indeed. It's always been the stern voice admonishing everyone, saying that they have to look after their accounts and not borrow too much and make sure their public accounts are clean and beautiful.
Alles in Ordnung.
Exactly. And then suddenly Berlin turns around, and not just any Berlin, but the Conservatives turn around and say, actually, no, let's borrow at least €500 billion euros, but what looks like it's more likely to be something more like 1.5 trillion euros over the next decade or so.
Wow.
In order to fix our infrastructure and to rearm. And it is that is quite an extraordinary volte-face, and it's driven, I think, by a mixture of things. It's obviously driven by the sheer panic unleashed across Europe. Mm-hmm. By the prospect that under Trump, the US might stop taking responsibility for Europe's security. And it's also driven, I think, by the growing disquiet in Germany, the fact that they've just had 2 years without any growth at all. And it may well be, and that there are deep structural problems which probably it'll take money to address.
I think on top of what Thomas has said, I would say that if this goes ahead and if we get similar types of moves from other EU countries, then this could facilitate the type of defence spending that we last saw during the Cold War. So it takes us into a kind of a different type of Europe, one that we haven't seen for a long time. And essentially this kind of post-Cold War peace dividend that has allowed European economies to continue with their welfare spending, their pension spending and so on, frankly, that is kind of ending now. And this German decision, I think, is one of the sort of big markers.
Well, that's what I was going to ask, Mark. Like, the European Union has traditionally been split on attitudes to debt, right? kind of like a north-south divide. And you have the frugals, led by Northern European countries like Germany, the Netherlands and Austria, typically calling for strict adherence to EU debt rules. But last week we had leaders from the entire bloc giving the thumbs up to a relaxation of these rules to allow for more defence spending. Is the Growth and Stability Pact, to give those rules their technical title, is it dead?
I don't think it's totally dead. Equally, I don't think it's totally ever been fully alive.
That's true. Yes.
It's something which has been honoured in the breach to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, people do like to say that when it comes down to it, it's actually the discipline imposed by the financial markets, which is more important, which arguably is the case.
Right.
However, I think the sheer fact of having a process out there has over the years imposed some degree of rigour and of rules and of benchmarking in this whole process. And I think it remains to be seen what comes out at the end of this process. There are a number of different options out there as to how you make allowances within the Stability and Growth Pact, whether, for example, it will be strictly all about defence spending that is allowed to be exempt from that, or whether it sort of ultimately ends up wider.
Right.
So I think we've yet to see that. So not totally dead just yet, I would argue.
Speaking of financial markets, this move by Germany has set bond markets and European defence stocks alight. Now, a reminder to our listeners that on bond markets, the price of a bond moves in the opposite direction to the yield of that bond. So if a bond falls in price, then the yield, or the rate of return investors demand to hold that bond, they jump. And German yields have soared. Sometimes that can be a sign that investors are worried about a country's ability to repay its debt. But in this case, that's not what's going on here. They see this as a sign that this move is good for growth. Right, Mark?
Yeah, the sell-off has been pretty massive. I mean, it was the biggest daily move since the 1990s in German bonds after that announcement. So, it's significant. That's partly to do that the markets are expecting higher issuance of bonds to pay for all of this. And of course, they're fleeing to stocks because they expect that those particularly defence stocks are going to do very well.
Yep, more supply.
You're right. In the broader sense, people aren't worried about German debt sustainability for the time being. And indeed, the yield that the German bonds attract is still below what, for example, US 10-year paper has to. So, add to that also that the euro rose over the last couple of days or so. So what we're seeing is still within the bounds of something that, broadly speaking, financial markets are saying it's positive.
What is interesting is that there's kind of been a flip, and European stocks are outperforming US stocks as we see the trade concerns impacting the Dow and Nasdaq, whereas this idea of a new paradigm shift is boosting European stocks. It's interesting. I don't think people had expected that at the start of the year.
One of the many surprises we've got used to over the last couple of weeks or so, yeah.
And speaking of surprises, it's quite a shock really, isn't it, Thomas, that it's Friedrich Merz, of all people, who's doing this 180?
It's striking because, of course, Friedrich Merz, he's very much from the conservative wing of the Christian Democrats. And he was also a real thorn in the side of all the coalition spending plans in the last government. So he was the one who took the government to the Constitutional Court to get their spending plans thrown out, saying that they were profligate. And it's precisely him who comes into office, takes a look at the numbers, and then rears up in horror and realizes that actually, no, that's not going to work out after all, and we're going to have to change course. This is a man who totally grew up in the German Atlanticist tradition. He's believed in it for his entire life. He speaks good English. He's a particular kind of German politician who talks and breathes Atlanticism and Germany's. And the kind of person who talks about the rules-based international order, really is socialized into that world and is a deep believer in it. And one of the fundamental pillars of that worldview has just been kicked out, essentially, by Trump.
Yeah.
I think that creates, as you say, space to rethink everything.
Has there been much opposition within Germany to this move?
It's interesting that most of the normal characters who you would expect, the usual suspects who you'd expect to be shouting that Germany is throwing in the towel and is risking terrible financial crisis, most of them have been fairly muted in their response. And I think that tells you that there is a real exhaustion and a real sense that we need to start spending money. We need to start building things again. Mm-hmm. And I think a sense of nervousness, just this fear is pushing people in that direction. I think there's also a bit of a generational shift in Germany. it wasn't so widely noticed, but a few days before this announcement came out from the would-be coalition partners, so Merz and the Social Democrats, a few days before that, it was the Bundesbank, the German central bank, which put out a statement put out an analysis saying that really it was time to start thinking about the debt paying. And I think that's in itself kind of seismic, because Germany has always had this reputation for fiscal obsessiveness, but nothing compared to Bundesbank, which is kind of like ground zero for fiscal discipline. The fact that they are coming out and saying different things, I think, really shows that there is something of a philosophical change happening in the German economics and policymaking professions.
Talk to me about the numbers here, Mark, with the projections for how this could impact German growth. What are analysts saying?
I mean, I've seen a few out there. I mean, I think there's one from the Kiel Institute was talking about if this equates to 1.5% extra defense spending, then that in turn gives you somewhere between 0.9% and 1.5% in extra growth, which isn't a massive amount. I mean, sure, I guess it's quite a lot when your economy is essentially stagnant, but this sort of speaks to one of the issues about defense spending and the limitations about stimulating further growth. I mean, sure, if you throw enough money at anything, then you're going to get some increase in output in turn. But the problem with spending on weapons is that those weapons get built and then they get put in storage until they get used in the war. So you don't have the kind of the ripple effects, or what economists call multipliers, that then kind of carry on rippling through the economy and give you more bang for your buck, as it were. So I think there's certainly an issue about that. What this really comes down to is how it manages to stimulate things longer term. For example, does it actually boost research and development in such a way that then starts leading to an industrial innovation renaissance of some kind? Are we going to see real increases in industrial capacity? And what about all of the labour skills shortages that we have? To what extent does this hold that back? And to what extent will that money get used to actually start doing something about those labour skill shortages? Those are the things which I think even now people are starting to look at and wonder what can be done there.
Because Germany is looking for its kind of industrial second act, isn't it? I mean, its auto industry, which is when you think of German industry, it's at the core of it, is obviously under threat from the rise of EVs, which are less labour intensive. So, yeah, I mean, Thomas, on the ground in Germany, are people hoping that this could be a gateway to technological breakthroughs, which can then spill over?
My colleagues in Frankfurt did a great story a couple of days ago, looking at precisely what you said, the car industry, and how defense manufacturers have started doing deals with car companies who are facing slack demand and all kinds of problems to take over their capacity. So,
yeah,
and it's fairly small scale right now. It's 100 workers here, 100 workers there. But there are a lot. I suppose fundamentally, a country that can build cars can probably build tanks too. So at some point, yes, there is scope for that to happen. On the kind of question of research renaissance, Germany does actually have quite a strong research infrastructure. It's got the Max Planck Institute, it's got the Fraunhofer Institute, which famously invented the MP3 file format and stuff like that. It actually is, in theory, is quite an important country in terms of scientific research. There have been noises about trying to attract disgruntled researchers from the US, for example, with the shuttering of large parts of the National Institutes of Health, it seems. Whether Germany will be swift enough to capitalize on that kind of thing, I'm not sure, but in principle it could happen.
If Germany is to quickly revive its flagging industrial economy, businesses say the country needs to radically reduce bureaucracy alongside plans to boost spending. Victoria Valdersee has been talking to executives across the country.
We spoke to companies in everything from shipping to energy to car component manufacturing, and they were all kind of echoing each other, giving countless examples of bureaucracy holding them up. Like, we had one business owner who makes a certain component for industrial clients in the car industry, for example. And he abandoned plans to automate part of his storage facility when he realized that the cost of meeting updated fire regulations was so high that he would lose money on the investment. So there's loads of examples like this where even Germany's own desire to do things like digitalize or automate is then held up by the fact that actually doing it is so complicated and requires so many forms that companies just end up being like, oh, it's just not worth the bother.
And so many inspectors, right? I mean, I was reading your story about the ladder inspectors. Tell us about that example.
So companies are legally required to employ a whole bunch of different inspectors for a whole bunch of different things. We spoke to the owner of this aluminium foundry who obviously has a bunch of ladders in his factory, and he has to employ a ladder inspector to inspect all of his ladders once a year and put a little sticker on them that says that they are functional.
Right.
He also has to show the documents from when he bought these ladders to sort of just show that their specifications are all right. And if he doesn't have the documentation, then he just can't use that ladder.
That's really quite something. But there have been efforts, haven't there, in the past to reduce the bureaucracy in Germany? Like, previous governments have tried. We're expecting to have a new government soon in Germany. What are the would-be coalition partners saying about bureaucracy? How important is it, say, for them to cut back on red tape?
So the party which won the most votes in the election, the Conservatives, the CDU, have said that they really care about this issue and want to tackle it. And when they were in the opposition, they did try to pass various laws that would loosen reporting rules and scrap some of these requirements to have inspectors and so on. The thing is, the CDU is probably going to be in a coalition with the SPD, the Social Democrats, who have previously blocked their attempts to loosen those rules because they're worried that it could lead to corporations being less accountable. And I think this is the same debate that we're actually seeing on an EU level, where there's also a lot of conversation around deregulation and how to make businesses more competitive from the region. And you have the one side of the companies and the employers who say, we desperately need this to be competitive. But then you have the other side of people who are concerned about the fact that, Europe has spent a lot of time making itself this sort of beacon of sustainability. And they're worried that deregulating is going to basically just take the pressure off of companies to be responsible for their environmental and human rights records.
And is it just about regulation? I mean, is cutting rules enough?
Yeah, so I think there's definitely also a cultural element to this in Germany, and that's something that several of these business owners told us themselves. People can be very risk averse. Even in German law, it's usually sort of laid out so that there's a provision for every possible outcome, no matter how unlikely that scenario is.
Yeah.
And I think undoing that mindset could be very, very difficult. Like even the man who told us about his ladder inspectors, he was the person who said, it's really important that the next government does something about bureaucracy. But he also said, it kind of protects me to have all of these inspectors and to have all of these rules.
Right.
Because if somebody does fall off a ladder, at least I can say it was checked.
So, Mark, we know that pumping money into defence isn't necessarily going to be a magic economic wand for Europe.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So this doesn't solve, for example, the fragmentation of capital markets that we've spoken a lot about before. And no, it doesn't necessarily get to the heart of productivity issues. But if the money is spent well, and if it's associated with other reforms, then it could be a start.
Mm-hmm.
We'll have to see. I think for me, one of the big challenges is where on earth are they going to find the money? Because, markets, it remains to be seen how much leeway they will give these already overstretched budgets. And if they start then having to cut into other areas of welfare spending, well, we know that already there is concern in Brussels and other EU capitals about what that would mean for the rise of the far right further down the line. So I think there are some really difficult questions about priorities that European capitals are going to have to face.
Well, that's true, right? Because, I mean, Germany is, in many respects, it's in a sweet spot. Its debt to GDP levels are way below other G7 countries. Like, it has room to borrow. That's not true of other countries in Europe. Like, we think of France, you think of Italy. So, I mean, Thomas, is there a perception in Germany that other areas will have to be cut?
So far, there hasn't been that much discussion about the cuts that would have to follow. And of course, as you say, Germany is the one country that does have fiscal room to borrow.
Yeah.
And I think there will be a lot of pushback, not least because everyone is so worried here about the far right. As we saw, the austerity all those years ago in Southern Europe greatly fueled the rise of the far right in Greece and in Spain. And now, actually, it's done much the same in Germany as well, where the AfD came second. First time, I mean, it's perhaps to over-egg it, but it's the first time since the Second World War that a far-right party was in such a strong position in the German parliament. So people are really worried about that, and I think there will be a real resistance to anything which is perceived as exacerbating the conditions, and particularly in Eastern Germany, where the party is so strong. People, I think, are going to want to direct investment to those regions still,
yeah,
and are going to want to ensure that the social safety net is not doesn't get too much more frayed, precisely because of that fear.
But Mark, other countries don't have that luxury.
Absolutely.
If they want to start ramping up military spending, other things logically are probably going to have to be cut.
Well, I mean, Emmanuel Macron has already started talking about sacrifices, and it really is hard to see how that plays out in a French debate where the budget is already a mess and where there is so much tension over the attempts to reform the pension system and so on. That really is one of the things that we'll be looking at most closely, I think, over the coming weeks. In Italy, which is also, I think, at this moment, somewhat below the NATO target for spending, how can it possibly increase its spending given its national debt levels? I think we can see Italian officials pleading more and more loudly for joint borrowing at the EU level to come and help them with this, because it's very difficult to see where the national funding would come from.
Mark, thank you so much. And Thomas, thank you so much.
Thanks, both of you.
Pleasure.
Thanks again to Mark, Thomas, Victoria, and everyone covering economics and markets for Reuters. If you're interested in more, subscribe to the Daily Markets newsletter, Morning Bid USA and Trading Day. There's a sign-up link in the description to today's show. There's also a newsletter to accompany this show called, wait for it, Reuters Econ World. We've put a sign-up link for that one also in today's pod description. Sound design, music composition, and engineering on this episode was by Josh Summer. Our podcast team includes Kim Vanell, Tara Oakes, Gail Issa, Christopher Wall-Jasper, Jonah Green, David Spencer, and Sharon Reich-Garson. Our executive producer is Leela de Kretzer. Remember, for all your daily news, check out our weekday show, Reuters World News. You can catch it on the Reuters app or wherever you listen to your podcasts.